So you want to own a medieval alehouse, a low room warm with wood smoke, a bench, a barrel, a bush hung over the door, neighbors drifting in after dark to drink the batch you brewed that morning and to argue about the harvest. It sounds like the softest business in the whole medieval economy. No caravan to lose in a desert, no branch in Bruges you'll never see, no king who might default on you and take the largest bank in the world down with him. So here is the first thing nobody tells you. You cannot buy a medieval alehouse because there is almost nothing to buy. There is no shop. There is no sign painted in gold. There is a house, usually somebody's actual house, and on the days there's ale ready, it becomes an alehouse, and on the days there isn't, it goes back to being a kitchen. What you are opening is not a building. It's a batch of ale and a piece of temporary permission to sell it. That's the whole enterprise. A pot of drink and the right to put a pole out the window. And that single strange fact that the business has almost no walls, no lock, no premises worth the name, turns out to explain everything. It explains who brewed. It explains why they were poor. It explains why the law treated them the way it did. And it explains the thing this whole story is really about, which is what happens to a kind of work the exact moment it becomes worth taking away from the people who do it. So let's brew one batch, put the bush out, and follow every penny in and out. By the end, you'll understand why the alehouse was the one medieval trade a poor person could enter, and precisely because of that, the one that could never make a poor person rich. Start with what the thing actually is, because we've inherited 3 words for it and jumbled all 3 together. An inn was the big one, a courtyard, a hall, stables, beds upstairs, a whole transport business dressed up as hospitality. A tavern, in the narrow medieval sense, leaned toward wine and toward a wealthier customer. The alehouse sat at the very bottom of that ladder. It sold ale, sometimes only ale. It usually had no rooms to let, no stable, no cellar full of Gascon wine. It might be a single room with a trestle and a few stools. It could be, quite literally, the front of a widow's cottage. When the law finally got around to defining the 3 of them under Edward VI in the middle of the 16th century, it drew exactly that line. An alehouse could sell drink, a tavern had to offer wine and food, and an inn had to put you up for the night. The alehouse is the humble end. It's the version of the business a household could run without ceasing to be a household. Which means the first thing you're acquiring isn't premises at all. It's a signal. In medieval England, when a household finished a brew and had ale ready to sell, they hung out an ale stake, a pole pushed out of a window or over the door, with a bush of leaves or a garland tied to the end. That bush was the entire marketing department. It told the village 2 things. Fresh ale is open here, and it's open for inspection. If you sold wine too, you tied on evergreen. That's where the old proverb comes from, good wine needs no bush, meaning quality sells itself and only the doubtful stuff needs advertising. The bush went up, the neighbors came, the drink got sold in a few days, and then the bush came down and you were just a family with an empty barrel again. A house that hung the bush out often enough and brewed well enough that people came back slowly became known as an alehouse. Nobody founded it, it accreted. Now, the money. What does it cost to get into this? And here the alehouse does something no other business in this series does. It lets you in almost for free. Think about what the trade actually needs. A vessel to heat water, often lead, a tub to mash the grain in, a shallow trough or 2 to cool the wort, some barrels to ferment and store it. That's essentially the kit. It is not nothing, but it is the sort of equipment that sat in a very large share of ordinary households already, because brewing was a normal domestic chore, like baking. Historians who've gone through the records find that the brewing gear was within reach of everyone except the genuinely poor. Compare that to what we've seen cost people entry elsewhere. The guild seat that ran to 9 years of a craftsman's wages, the banking partnership that opened with 10,000 gold florins, the saloon bankroll of $5,000 sitting frozen on a card table. The alehouse asks for a mash tub and some barrels. There is no capital wall. There is barely a fence. So the real cost isn't the equipment. It's the inputs, and they're humble too. You need grain, barley for preference, because barley makes poor bread but excellent malt, though oats and wheat got used constantly depending on what the region grew. You need that grain malted, which means soaked, sprouted, and dried. A job so specialized that plenty of households bought their malt ready-made or had it done on a nearby farm. You need it milled, and unless you owned a hand quern, you paid the local miller his cut, commonly 1 part in 24 of the grain, skimmed straight off the top before you'd brewed a drop. You need fuel, and this one bites harder than people expect, because you are boiling and heating large volumes of liquid, and firewood is a real, recurring, unforgiving cost. You need clean water, more of it than seems possible, and you need labor. Which brings us to the person actually standing at the tub. Because for most of the medieval period in England, that person was a woman. This is the fact the cozy picture leaves out, and it's the hinge the whole story turns on. Brewing ale was women's work. Not occasionally. Overwhelmingly. The word tells you a man who brewed was a brewer, a woman who brewed was a brewster, and the word alewife enters the record meaning a woman who keeps an alehouse. The law that regulated the trade kept using the female form, the brewster, as the default because everyone knew who was doing this. Public health records, court rolls, tax presentments from before the Black Death treat brewing as a fundamentally female occupation. And here is why, and it matters because it's not a happy reason. Brewing was women's work precisely because it fitted around a household and precisely because it wasn't worth enough to be anything more. A married woman could brew in the kitchen she was already standing in, using grain the family already had, with the help of children who were already there, and turn a surplus of barley and a day's firewood into a few pennies of cash, which for most households was the only cash they ever saw. It was flexible, it was intermittent, it was low status, it was low skill in the sense that everyone's mother knew roughly how, even if brewing well was genuinely hard. It was, in short, exactly the kind of work a society hands to women when it doesn't consider the work important. A wife brewed a batch when money was short, sold it to the neighbors, and stopped when the need passed. Historians describe most commercial brewsters as brewing more out of necessity than ambition, topping up the household, not building an empire. That's the alehouse. It's the medieval side hustle, and its workforce was women because nobody with power wanted the job. Now let's put the bush out and see what the state does the moment you try to sell. The moment your ale goes on sale, you come under the Assize. The Assize of bread and ale, in place across much of England by the 1260s, was the first food regulation in English history, and it did something clever and quietly ruthless. It fixed the price of ale to the price of grain. When wheat, barley, and oats sold at set prices, brewers in towns had to sell 2 gallons of ale for a penny, and brewers in the countryside 3 or even 4 gallons for a penny, the cheaper rate reflecting cheaper rural grain. London's version in 1266 pinned the strongest ale to a set measure per penny. On paper, this is consumer protection. It stops the alewife gouging the village in a bad harvest. Look at the arithmetic, though, because the arithmetic is where the real design lives. Out in the country, a quarter penny a gallon meant a standard 36-gallon barrel of ale sold for 9p. Now run it backwards. To brew entirely from barley and just recover the cost of that grain, you'd need to squeeze 3 barrels out of a single quarter of it. Add fuel, add the miller's cut, add some margin so you've actually earned something for a day bent over a steaming tub. Now you need 4 barrels from that quarter, maybe 5. But the ale tasters were specifically there to stop you watering your ale down that far. A brew stretched that thin wasn't sellable ale, it was cloudy water, and they'd fail it. So here's the trap. The price the Assize allowed and the quantity of grain the Assize allowed did not leave room for an honest profit. It was, for practical purposes, impossible to obey the Assize and make money at the same time. So almost nobody obeyed it. And here's the beautiful, cynical part. The authorities knew. They didn't actually want to shut every brewster in England. So the fine for breaking the Assize quietly stopped being a punishment and became a fee. Year after year, the same women turned up in the manor court were amerced, fined. A few pence for selling ale above the Assize, paid it, and went straight back to brewing. Historians are blunt about what that means. The amercement for breaking the Assize of ale had, by the early 14th century, become little more than a licensing fee for the privilege of brewing and selling ale. The law that pretended to cap your profit was, in reality, an annual tax on your existence, dressed in the costume of a crime. You weren't a criminal. You were a subscriber who hadn't been told it was a subscription. And the enforcement had a face: the ale conner, sometimes called the ale taster, an officer chosen every year in the local court to go around and assay the ale before it could be sold. When you hung out your bush, you were summoning him. His oath, versions of which survive from the 14th and 15th centuries, bound him to come and taste any Brewster's ale when required and to help set a fair price on it. Now, one honest note, because this series doesn't sell you legends. There's a famous story that the ale conner wore leather breeches and tested ale by pouring some on a wooden bench, sitting in it for half an hour and checking whether his trousers stuck. Sugar and bad ale gluing him to the seat. It's a great story. It shows up in German, Flemish, and Bohemian versions too. And in England, there is essentially no contemporary evidence for it at all. The surviving oaths talk about tasting ale, not sitting in it. He drank it. That was the test. The breeches are folklore that got promoted to fact, and you should file it next to a lot of other things people know about the Middle Ages. What was real was the punishment, and this is where the story stops being quaint. Sell short measure or sell ale the court judged bad, and you faced more than a fine. There was the pillory, there was the tumbrel, the duncart, and above all, there was the cucking-stool, a chair, sometimes built like a commode, to which the offender was strapped and displayed outside her own door, or paraded through the town while neighbors came to jeer. Read the old statutes, and you find the pronoun doing quiet work. The brewer of evil ale, one Scottish compilation says, "She shall be put upon the cuck-stool." She. The law expected the brewer to be a woman, and it built a humiliation specifically shaped to be inflicted on one. The same offense that got a male baker the pillory tended to route a female brewster toward a punishment about public shame and the body. Keep that in view, because it's about to connect to everything. Now, how big could this get? Let's look at the ceiling, because the contrast is the point. The largest brewing operations of the age weren't alehouses at all. They were institutions. Take the accounts of St. Paul's Cathedral in London in the 1280s. In a single year, the cathedral's brewhouse brewed around 100 times, each batch running to hundreds of gallons, producing on the order of 68,000 gallons of ale in 12 months. And of that ocean of drink, the amount actually sold to outsiders was 37 gallons. The rest was consumed in-house by the canons and their servants on generous daily allowances. That's what big looked like. A self-supplying machine floating on rents from its own farms, barely touching the open market. Your alewife, meanwhile, is brewing a few quarters of grain when she can afford to and selling every drop to the people on her lane. Between the cathedral and the cottage lies the entire spectrum of the trade, and almost everyone selling ale to the public lives down at the cottage end. Let me give you one of them, because for once we can. Her name was Margery Kempe, and she lived in Bishop's Lynn in Norfolk at the turn of the 15th century, a merchant's daughter who later became one of the more extraordinary religious figures of the English Middle Ages and left behind a book about her life. Before all that, she went into brewing. She tells us she became one of the greatest brewers in the town for 3 or 4 years. And then it collapsed. The way she describes it, the ale kept failing. The barm, the yeast, would fall, and batch after batch was ruined, until her servants grew ashamed to work for her and left. She read it as God's judgment on her pride and gave it up. Now, the Assize records for Lynn actually catch her, recorded, tellingly, under her husband, John Kempe's name, because that was the normal way a married woman's trade appeared in the books. One year she's brewing a solid commercial quantity, the next year barely anything. Historians who've looked closely suspect her failure was mundane, very likely a mash at the wrong temperature, leaving sugars the yeast couldn't finish. Exactly the falling barm she describes. But look at what her story shows you, sitting right there in the one alewife whose voice survived. Entry was easy. A wealthy woman walked straight into one of the greatest brewers in town. Staying was hard. One run of bad luck at the tub and the whole thing evaporated because there was no vault behind it, no branch network, no capital cushion. Just a woman, a barrel, and a fermentation that wouldn't hold. That's the alehouse in one life. So far, this looks like a modest, survivable little trade. Low to enter, hard to grow, taxed by a fine, wearing a mask, watched by a man with a cup, but yours. For a century or two, that's what it was. Now watch the ground shift under it, because the ending of this story isn't a bankruptcy. It's an eviction. And the people evicted are the women who built the trade. Three things change, and they change together, in the century after the Black Death of 1348. First, grain gets cheaper and wages rise because plague killed so many people that the survivors held more land and more bargaining power. Cheaper grain and fatter purses mean ale gets cheaper to make and people drink more of it per head. The survivors of the plague, better fed and better paid, drank more ale, not less. Second, that rising, thickening demand starts to reward anyone who can brew in real volume, consistently, for a market rather than a lane. The trade begins to split in two: the people who brew and the people who sell, pulling apart into separate specialized jobs. And third, the technological hammer blow: hops arrive. Hops matter more than any other single thing in this story. So hold on to why. Traditional English ale had no hops. It was malt, water, yeast, and time. And it soured fast. A few days, a week, maybe longer for strong ale. But fundamentally, a perishable good you had to sell locally and quickly. That perishability is the invisible wall that kept the trade small and domestic and female. You can't build a big business on a product that dies in your hand. Then, in the 15th century, hopped beer comes across from the Low Countries, brought by Flemish and Dutch brewers and merchants. Hops don't just flavor the drink bitter, they preserve it. Hopped beer keeps for weeks, travels in barrels, survives a journey. Suddenly the drink is durable. Suddenly you can brew a huge batch, store it, ship it, and sell it far from the tub it was made in. And durability changes who owns a trade, instantly and against the women, because a business built on a product that lasts is a business worth scaling. Scaling means bigger premises, bigger vats, more fuel, more servants, more upfront money, and, the moment real money and prestige enter, organization. Men. Beer brewing in England grew up male almost from the start. Larger breweries, more capital, more hired hands, guild structures. In London, the Brewing Guild had women in it, around a third of its members in the early 15th century, but they were never truly free of it, rarely wore its livery, never governed it. They were tolerated members of an institution being run by, and increasingly for, men. And where wives went on brewing beside their husbands, their work slid out of the public record and behind the husband's name, exactly as it had for Margery Kempe, present in reality, invisible on paper. Then regulation finished the job. As brewing got more profitable, it got more controlled, and control means licenses, and licenses went to men. The numbers are stark. In Oxford, women led about a fifth of brewing households in the early 14th century. Within a couple of generations, that was already sliding. By the 16th century, across England, fewer than 1 in 10 brewing licenses went to women, and most of those went to widows carrying on a dead husband's business, not to women trading in their own right. Single women and widows were pushed out first and hardest, and some towns simply legislated women out of the drink altogether. In 1540, the city of Chester banned women between 14 and 40 from selling ale outright, on the stated fear that young alewives would use their appeal to lead men into immorality, which is the last ugliest gear in the machine, and it's the reason to remember that cucking-stool. As women were being pushed out of the trade, the culture produced a monster to justify it: the alewife as cheat, as scold, as drunk, as slattern, as a danger to men's purses and men's souls. She short measures you. She waters the ale. She's loud, lewd, and dishonest. By the early 16th century, the poet John Skelton could publish a portrait of an alewife, Eleanor Rumming, so grotesque, so physically filthy, so revolting in her person and her brewing, that it reads like propaganda, and functionally it was. Church carvings put alewives in hell, handing false measures to devils. This wasn't a neutral description of bad brewers, it was a reputation being manufactured around women at the precise historical moment their work became worth confiscating. First, you make the trade profitable. Then you make its traditional workers disgusting. Then you take it. The order is not a coincidence. So, could you get rich owning a medieval ale house? Let's do the honest arithmetic, and I have to be straight with you the way this series always is. No neat annual ledger for a single alewife survives the way we'd want. What follows is a reconstruction built from grain prices, the Assize, wage data, and what the court rolls imply, not a spreadsheet dug out of a Norfolk chest. With that flag firmly planted, here's the shape of it. A good year at the cottage end. You brew regularly, say a batch every week or two when you can lay hands on grain and fuel. Each brew turns a modest quantity of barley into a few barrels of ale, and you sell it at, or a little above, the Assize to neighbours who'll always want it. After the grain, the malting, the miller's cut, the firewood, and the annual fine that everyone knows is really your license, you clear a genuine but small surplus in cash, the kind of money that, for a laboring household, is the difference between having coins and having none. Not a fortune, a cushion, a few weeks of a laborer's wages across a whole year of intermittent brewing, earned in the gaps around everything else the household needed you to do. That is a good year, and for the people doing it, it was worth a great deal, because the alternative was no cash at all. A bad year is not subtle. The harvest fails and grain jumps, and the Assize won't let your price rise to match, so you're squeezed from both ends, paying more for barley while forbidden to charge more for ale, or the fuel runs short. Or, like Margery, your fermentation dies and 3 batches in a row go down the drain with the grain still in them. There's no reserve to absorb it because there was never enough margin to build one. You stop brewing, hang up the empty barrel, and wait for a better season, and if you're a widow or a single woman doing this alone, a bad enough year is the one that pushes you off the license list for good because the whole system is now leaning on you to quit. So who actually got rich off medieval ale? Follow the money, and it is never the alewife. It's the maltster who processed everyone's grain. It's the miller taking his 24th of every quarter, wet or dry, good year or bad. It's the landlord renting the premises that the bigger operations came to need. It's the man who moved into hopped beer early, built a real brewery, joined the guild, took the license, and shipped durable barrels to markets the alewife could never reach. And it's the institution, the cathedral, the college, the great household, floating on its own rents, brewing an ocean, and answering to no Assize. Every one of those winners is a step removed from the woman at the tub. The alewife made the drink. Other people made the money, and then took the drink too. Could you get rich then? No. And that no is the whole point, because it was never the failure of the alehouse. It was the design. The alehouse existed exactly because it was the one trade with no wall around it. The trade a household with a spare bushel of barley and an afternoon of firewood could enter without permission, without capital, without a guild's blessing. That openness is what made it available to the poor and to women. And that same openness is what guaranteed it could never make them rich. Because a business anyone can enter is a business no one can corner. The margin stayed thin because the door stayed open. The women stayed because the men didn't want in. And the day the men wanted in, the day hops made the drink keep, and demand made it worth scaling, and profit made it worth regulating. The door that had let the women in was rebuilt as a wall to keep them out. Licenses, guilds, capital, big premises, a reputation stitched onto the alewife to make her removal feel like hygiene. Within a couple of centuries, the trade that had been so overwhelmingly women's that the law couldn't imagine a male default was a trade of men, and the brewster had been argued, taxed, shamed, and legislated back into her kitchen. So here's the truth you were really buying. You were never buying a business. There was no business to buy. That was the whole nature of the thing. What you had, for as long as you were allowed to have it, was the right to turn your own home into a shop for a few days at a time and sell the surplus of your own labor to the people on your street. It was the smallest, freest, most open door in the entire medieval economy. And the history of the alehouse is, start to finish, the history of what happens to that kind of work. Humble, domestic, done by women, tolerated precisely because nobody important valued it, the moment somebody important finally does. The ale never made anyone rich. It was never supposed to. It was just cheap enough and open enough and beneath everyone's notice enough to belong to the people who had nothing else, right up until it was worth something, and then it belonged to somebody else. You thought you were pouring a quiet pint for the neighbors. What you were actually holding was the clearest case in economic history of a simple, brutal rule. Work is left to the powerless exactly as long as it stays unprofitable, and the reward for making it pay is watching it taken away.